Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Danny McCoy. I'm the president of the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland. You're very welcome to what is our 174th session, and our meeting tonight is a symposium on the topic of international trade and investment agreements, fit for future purpose. So it's kind of a looking forward on those trade agreements, and we're very fortunate tonight to have three contributors who'll be able to shed quite a bit of insight on this fairly dramatic time for global trade agreements. Chris Barton is the Director General of the UK Department of International Trade. He's the Director General of Trade Agreements. Ailish Campbell, Dr. Ailish Campbell is the Canadian ambassador to the EU, but has also been the Chief Trade Commissioner for Canada in recent times. So again, lots of experience on future of trade agreements as they're developing. And then we're also joined by Professor Martina Lawless of the Economic and Social Research Institute. And Martina has done a lot of work on trade agreements in recent times, particularly in the Irish context, in more recent space on given Brexit and so on. So what we'll do is each contributor will give their own contribution for 20 minutes. Chris will be up first, then Ailish, then Martina, and then we'll open it up for the Q&A session. We will be recording this session as well, and this will go forward to our journal. But without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the Honorary Secretary, Ronan Lyons, to take us through just some of the Society's business before we start.
Thank you very much, Danny. The only bit of business I have to do is just to read the minutes of the last ordinary meeting of the Society, which is the fourth meeting of the 174th session of the Society, which took place at 5 p.m. on Thursday, the 25th of March, online due to the COVID-19 pandemic and associated restrictions on physical meetings, with the assistance of Trinity Research in Social Sciences. President Danny McCoy was in the chair for a paper entitled Income Volatility on Dairy Farms in Ireland by Jason Lockery of Teagasc, Declan O'Connor of MTU, Trevor Donlan of Teagasc, Tia Hennessy of UCC, and Fiona Thorne of Teagasc. The proposal of the vote of thanks was made by Tig Buckley and seconded by Paul Caskey, Tig being of the IFA and Paul, the Agri-Food and Biosciences Institute of Northern Ireland. And there were contributions from the floor by John Fitzgerald, Mary Keeney, Thomas Conifrey, Michael Darcy, and Joe Tracy. Following the discussion and response from the authors, the President thanked those who'd contributed and brought the meeting to a close.
Great, thanks, Ronan. So without further ado, I'm going to ask Chris to lead us off. So Chris, over to you, and thank you again for joining us. And just hit your mute. There we go.
Am I live? Great. Good. Well, look, good afternoon, and many thanks indeed, President Danny McCoy, and to my fellow panelists, and to everyone who's listening today. It's a great pleasure to be here and to participate in the symposium today. As Danny has said, my name is Chris Barton. I'm currently the Acting Director General for Trade Negotiations in the UK's Department for International Trade. Last year, I led the goods aspects of the UK-EU trade negotiations, and I've held a range of trade roles prior to that. So what I want to do today is really talk about four key issues. One is the need to support free and fair trade. Secondly, to talk a little bit of the range of mechanisms we have to do that. Then to ask what the FTAs bring to the party. And finally, how can we ensure they remain effective? So a few comments on each. So first, the need to support free and fair trade. And I should start with a health warning. As a representative of UK government and at a personal level, I am an avowed supporter of the benefits of free and fair trade. I will not be giving a neutral talk. I believe it is a force for good, that free trade drives economic growth, it creates better jobs, it increases consumer choice and value, and the fairness benefit of trade preserves our standards, protects our business from unfair competition, and promotes our environmental and wider policy goals. And I think in our current situation, free and fair trade has a particularly key role to play in increasing prosperity in all parts of our nations as part of our levelling up agendas. It can aid our post-COVID recovery, and it can encourage development of the green economy. So I, and far more significantly the UK government, are fans. Now, I think that case for trade needs constantly restating. It's not always an easy case to make, and some of the arguments against trade are as superficially compelling as they're fundamentally flawed. And unfortunately, that shows. While the global economy has been on a long-run trend towards greater openness for many years, that growth has slowed recently. We've seen some significant declines in world GDP trade to GDP ratio, and where once global trade significantly outpaced global GDP in terms of growth, the two have converged recently. And the nature of the trade barriers that lies behind that has also changed. Tariffs, once seen as the most important barrier to trade, have reduced substantially, which is great, from an average of about 25% at MFN level in 1989 to below 10% now. But that progress has stalled, and new barriers are emerging, largely in the form of regulatory and non-tariff barriers. And data suggests that as a result, the world has become more protectionist over the last decade. For example, the WTO reported that the stockpile of trade restrictive measures applied over the last decade has resulted in $1.6 trillion of world imports being affected by restrictions, and that figure is rising, and it's probably an underestimate. So you get the picture. Trade is really important, free and fair trade, but it's under threat. So secondly, how should we respond? Which takes me to the range of mechanisms to support free and fair trade. And perhaps surprisingly, given my job title as DG of Trade Negotiations, I suggest first that we should be quite humble about the role that FTAs can play. They're a very important part of the solution, as I'll come on to, but they are only a part. And in an ideal world, they would not be necessary at all. So arguably the most important part of the solution is actually unilateral measures that countries can take. It is in every country's power to lower its tariff, services, and non-tariff barriers of its own accord. In the UK, for example, we've already set a simpler, lower tariff regime than the EU's common external tariff, almost doubling the number of products that are tariff-free to account for nearly 50% of the products we trade. And that reflects a commitment to support global growth through trade and to maintain an open and competitive UK market. So that sort of unilateral measure we can take. And we can take those unilateral measures beyond tariffs. For example, in the UK, we're unilaterally pursuing customs facilitations, most notably through a 2025 border strategy, through which we aim to, over the next 5 years, deliver the world's most effective border. Unilateral measures that help trade. And they can help developing countries as well. For example, in the UK, we launched our own generalised system of scheme of preferences in January, which was largely a replication of the EU scheme, so delivering duty-free, quota-free access to around 47 least developed countries and tariff reductions for over 20 others. And as well as benefiting those countries, and hence some of the poorest people on this planet, it benefits UK consumers and increases our supply chain diversity, and we'll be consulting on ways to improve it. And then finally, on unilateral measures, linking to the fair trade domestically, would recall the role of robust trade remedy provisions to protect our business from unfair competition. So in the UK, we're now running our independent trade remedy system with our soon-to-be Trade Remedies Authority, which will help protect domestic industries against injury from unfair trading practices. So there's a whole lot of stuff that we can do unilaterally without getting into formal trade agreements. We can also do quite a lot bilaterally without FTAs. For example, the UK, as many other countries, have an extensive program to identify and seek to resolve individual market access barriers for our exporters in other countries. We develop new web-based services to support business in navigating those barriers that remain. And we've got a broad and deep network of staff and programs to promote our exports and attract inward investment. Most countries have these things, and they're really important for delivering trade without having formal trade agreements. And finally, of course, there's the multilateral level. That is, in theory at least, the first best solution for opening trade. It allows us to do so in a consistent and holistic manner across the globe. It avoids the complexities and bureaucracy of rules of origin, and it ensures shared rules to ensure trade is fair as well as free. And so again, from the UK perspective, we're going to work multilaterally to strengthen the international trading system, to reform the WTO, to update the rules in support of free and fair trade, and to progress further liberalisation. So a range of measures we've got to make sure that we are exploiting the benefits of free and fair trade. And FTAs are therefore by no means the be-all and end-all of trade policy. Indeed, a vast amount of trade occurs without any specific government involvement at all. In a perfect world, we wouldn't need FTAs. But of course, third point, what FTAs can bring to the party. The problem is the world, of course, is not perfect. A wholly unilateral approach doesn't reduce other countries' barriers. It risks putting domestic firms at a competitive disadvantage, and it reduces leverage to deliver access abroad. Informal bilateral engagement isn't always effective, and the policies and practices of different countries mean that it's not always in our interest to be equally open to all. There are commitments we may wish to agree with some, but not others. And the difficulties of delivering meaningful liberalisation at the multilateral level are all too obvious. And that's where FTAs can have a crucial role to play. So on the UK side, I'd say we've been very active on this agenda already, most obviously perhaps in agreeing a high quality FTA with our partners and friends in the EU, and very pleased that that has been ratified by the European Parliament today. Or was it yesterday, but just yesterday, just ratified, but that's excellent news. Of course, it doesn't replicate the single market or the customs union, and therefore there are, of course, a range of barriers now that there weren't there before, but it does deliver significant economic value compared to a non-negotiated outcome, including eliminating all tariffs for trade in domestically produced goods. So that's an example of an FTA having a really positive effect. We've also agreed replacement FTAs with 67 non-EU countries with whom we no longer benefit from existing EU FTA deals. Now we've left. Those replacement agreements cover almost 99% of the trade that benefited from FTAs when we're EU members and cover almost £900 billion of trade. And now we're looking to go further. We want to improve some of the deals we've replicated. The Japan deal was already an enhancement on the EU's one. We're looking to enhance the EU-EFTA one. We are looking to improve our deals with Canada, with Mexico, next year with Switzerland, South Korea, Turkey. We're negotiating entirely new deals with Australia, New Zealand, the US, and seeking accession to CPTPP. So a vast amount of activity. The question is, why are we doing this? What do we think these deals can deliver? Well, at macro level, they can deliver significant increases in trade and growth. Just for example, UK-Japan deal could increase our bilateral trade by nearly £16 billion. An ambitious UK-US deal could do so by about 15 billion, and that would increase UK GDP by about 3.4 billion. An Australia deal could increase UK GDP by 500 million. So there are really significant economic benefits that can come from FTAs. So while it's sometimes fashionable to say FTAs have a day, that is not what our analysis suggests. And then at a more specific level, FTAs can deliver a very broad range of benefits that go far beyond tariff liberalisation. That includes customs, technical barriers to trade, sanitary, phytosanitary standards, investment, IP, procurement, and much more. Just to give a concrete example, FTAs secure legal certainty and predictability for services exporters overseas, and that's crucial for an economy such as the UK, in which services contribute nearly 80% of GDP and employ over 30 million people. So the inclusion of ambitious commitments in FTAs will remove barriers to services trade, provide for greater choice, innovation and competition, and deliver meaningful benefits to businesses and consumers across the world. So for example, in the UK-Japan deal, that included mobility for business people, securing more flexibility for Japanese and British companies to move talent into each country and covering a range of UK skilled workers to enter Japan. So they can deliver a lot in terms of fair trade. FTAs can also deliver benefits in terms of fair trade as well as free trade. So for example, in our outline approaches to FTAs with the US, New Zealand and Australia, we've committed to seeking provisions on fair competition transparency and sustainability. So the latter will help enable trade in low carbon goods and services, supporting innovation in sectors such as offshore wind, smart energy systems and low carbon and energy from waste. So what can FTAs bring to the party? Answer: a lot, both in terms of the free trade, giving significant economic benefits, and the fair trade side of it, delivering and preserving our interests in a range of different issues, including sustainability, transparency, and competition. So that brings me then, fourth and finally, to how can we ensure that FTAs remain effective in a world where a lot of things are changing? How can we make them be a maximum benefit for our economies and societies? Just three aspects I'll bring out and then wrap up. I think perhaps the most obvious way to keep them effective is to update their content. So, for example, the UK-Japan deal is one of the world's most forward-leading FTAs with respect to digital trade and data. It includes commitments to the free flow of trusted data across borders. And why does that matter? It gives businesses the confidence that they can collect, process, and transfer data without unnecessary red tape. It includes commitments to maintain legal frameworks for personal data protection, giving consumers confidence that the UK's high standards of data protection will be supported and exported throughout international trade. And it includes protections for source code and cryptography, commitments to protection for consumers engaged in online commerce, and steps towards digital by default trading systems through supporting the use of e-contracts and e-signatures. And so that's one aspect in which we can ensure that FTAs remain very effective and more effective is by developing these new areas of trade agreements in more detail. Then secondly, in parallel to these improvements in content, it is equally important to consider the process of FTAs too. And that is absolutely key for maintaining confidence and support for our FTA agendas. And we've seen from previous experiences, for example, in the EU-US TTIP negotiations, how it is possible to lose the confidence of the public, and then that makes progression of a trade deal, however good it is on paper, really difficult to land. So that's something that in the UK we've put in place a whole suite of enhanced transparency and scrutiny arrangements to ensure that we are getting the process right. So, for example, we need to engage the public. And that's why in the UK, we've run a public consultation in advance of FTA negotiations, supported that by publication of detailed economic scoping assessments and objectives upfront to allow for informed debate. We communicate regularly on progress, and at the end of negotiations, the treaty text will be made publicly available, accompanied by explanatory documents and independently scrutinized impact assessments, including, importantly, the FTA's consistency on human, animal and plant life and health, animal welfare and environmental standards. And that is, these levels of openness are really important to engage the public by being as transparent as possible and showing that we are respecting key sensitivities. And we also, in process terms, need to engage the key stakeholders with specific interests. So that's why in the UK, we've set up mechanisms for more targeted engagement, such as through sector-specific trade advocacy advisory groups, alongside regular briefings and so forth with business, civil society, and think tanks. And that helps to ensure we're devising a trade policy that works for the whole of the UK and provides new opportunities. In the UK system, we also engage actively with our devolved administrations in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The details of that will be different in different countries, but in a lot of countries, this is an important part of ensuring that FTAs deliver. So in the UK system, the UK government is responsible for negotiating international trade agreements on behalf of all the nations and regions in the UK. But the nature of modern trade agreements means they increasingly intersect with areas of devolved competence and implementation. And therefore, it's really important that we work closely with them to deliver the policy that reflects the interests of all the nations within the UK. And we've got a lot of engagement to do that. And then finally, of course, there's Parliament. In most countries, engagement here is key for both legal reasons and legitimacy reasons. So we provide regular updates and briefings to our parliamentary select committees, so they've got the information they need. Those committees can report on the deal. Parliament has the opportunity to prevent ratification if it's unhappy. And we've drawn a lot from experience in other countries such as Canada, Australia, and New Zealand in putting those measures in place. So that whole issue of the process of FTAs, I think, is as important as the content if we're going to get them through. And then very briefly to wrap up, the final bit in terms of making our deals more effective is in terms of implementation. If we don't ensure that the FTAs are put into practice and used by business, then they're nothing more than pages on a shelf. So most FTAs contain a range of implementation measures, such as committee structures and dialogues and dispute resolution mechanisms, which matter because they provide a framework for monitoring and enhancing our bilateral trade agreements and tackling persistent barriers. And in parallel, we need to ensure the opportunities of trade agreements are implemented by business. So we're regularly considering how we can better promote the benefits of trade agreements to business, including in SMEs, and simplify the processes and then monitor their uptake. So let me conclude as I get to the end of my time. I'd say so 4 key messages I've been trying to get across. For one, there is a hugely compelling case for free and fair trade, but we need to keep making it. Secondly, we've got a wide range of mechanisms to enable that free and fair trade, of which FTAs are just one. Thirdly, that FTAs have delivered significant economic value, but they can be improved to deliver much more. And then finally, the content of FTA matters, but the process and the implementation matters just as much. So we look forward in the UK to continue to be at the forefront of all these aspects. We look forward to working further with our partners domestically and internationally as we do so. And thank you very much. I will stop there.
Great. Thanks very much, Chris. That was really took all of the dimensions for the debate and particularly for the future proofing of it. So Ailish, you're up next.
Great. Hi, Danny. Can you hear me?
I can hear you perfectly.
Great. Thanks so much. And thank you, Danny and Ronan and the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland for the invitation today, and also to Chris for that great first presentation. I've been looking forward to this discussion to take stock of how free trade agreements and, of course, other economic and social environmental policies can help expand trade and investment, jobs, and especially how modern agreements like the Canada-EU Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement are fit for future purpose and designed to help our economies both recover from the pandemic and thrive in the future. I'm going to focus my remarks today on CETA. It is a modern and progressive trade agreement for Canada, Ireland, and all EU member states. And for over 3.5 years now, CETA has built a track record of inclusive, environmentally sustainable, and durable wealth creation on both sides of the Atlantic. In 2020, CETA has also cushioned our economies against a bigger decline to our trade-exposed sectors during the pandemic. Of course, Ireland is also at the same time as being a fantastic trade partner for Canada, nested inside the single market of the EU, and I take note of the European Parliament's approval of the EU-UK deal yesterday, now approved by the Council. Canada, of course, in addition to CETA, has our new NAFTA agreement with the US and Mexico, our comprehensive and progressive Trans-Pacific partnership with partners like Japan, Vietnam, Australia, Chile, and New Zealand, and as well our commitment to the World Trade Organization, where we're working very hard on the renewal of the appellate body and in the Ottawa Group on important initiatives like trade and health. So while I think both Ireland and Canada have an incredibly broad experience with trade and with closer economic integration, as I say, I want to focus in today on using CETA as a case study. COVID-19 has certainly highlighted the interconnected nature of our economies, and by extension, the importance of strong ties, not only trade, but also people to people and at the multilateral level. CETA and agreements like the World Trade Organization and our constant commitment to their renewal and update will be even more important in advancing our shared global economic recovery. So my first point to you here today is that CETA is working and has led to impressive results, a real expansion of our trade, of our bilateral two-way investment, and as a result, economic opportunity for both small, medium, and large businesses. Before the pandemic swept across the world in 2020, total merchandise trade between Canada and the EU reached a record high of 66.8 billion in 2019, equivalent to a 27% increase compared to that level in 2016, the year before CETA came into provisional effect. Over that same time period, Canada's trade with the world grew by 13.5%, while the EU's trade with the world grew by 17.5%. Moreover, since the implementation of CETA, Canada-EU bilateral trade has increased at an annual average growth rate of almost 8%, about double that seen in the pre-CETA period. Canada-Ireland trade performance under CETA has been even more impressive. Our bilateral merchandise trade was 2.5 billion euro, an increase of 52% in 2020 compared with the last year before CETA came into implementation, where we have merchandise trade data of 2016. So beyond showing how great a customer for Irish goods and services Canada is, this also translated to increased prosperity and jobs for the Irish economy across a number of sectors. This same performance can be observed on the investment side, which is now a key part of the Canada-EU relationship. The stock of Canadian investment in the EU increased 16% to $305 billion from 2016 to 19, and FDI stock from the EU and Canada increased 19% to 308.4 billion over the same period. And again, importantly, this expansion has been broad-based and includes a broad range of sectors. I'm also happy to share that more Canadian small businesses are now exporting to the EU, and they're doing a greater amount of business with a broader range and diversity of EU small businesses. Right before the pandemic, close to 8,500 Canadian merchandise exporters were active in the EU market, and that represented an increase of more than 500 firms compared to 2016, and nearly 49,000 EU firms were imported from Canada, representing an increase of 5% compared to 2016. Based on Statistics Canada data, more than 88% of Canadian companies that export to Ireland are SMEs. And the share of SME exporters to Ireland has grown since CETA provisional application began. Trade also rose in almost all sectors and in almost all member states. And EU products now represent a greater share of Canada's total imports. The top 5 Canadian imports from the EU all rose again since the implementation of CETA. Machinery, the top product sector, led all products and expanded almost 30%, or 2.6 billion euro. Imports of motor vehicles and parts, pharmaceutical products as well also posted strong growth. Agricultural products also represent 9.3% of total bilateral trade between Canada and the EU, a sector of incredible strength for Ireland. And trade in these products was 14.8% higher in 2019 compared to the pre-CETA level in 2016. And EU exports, as opposed to Canadian exports, accounted for much of that two-way growth. Companies on both sides of the Atlantic have increasingly taken advantage of preferential tariff rates under CETA. And I'm really pleased to show that the utilization rate, or the number of businesses taking advantage of preferential rates, is only increasing. It's about 55 to 57% across the EU average, but Ireland is a super user. Ireland totally stands out as the top user of the agreement, with your businesses using the preferential rates in our Canada-EU deal at 76% on trade in both directions in 2020. So that means both Irish and Canadian importers are taking advantage and truly understand the benefits of the preferential tariffs that we've negotiated under CETA. They're importing at a lower cost and, of course, selling to consumers at more competitive prices. Another sign that CETA has had an impact in spurring trade creation is that products with significant tariff reductions have posted even stronger growth. For example, trade of products that experienced higher tariff reductions showed an almost 20% increase in 2019 compared to 2016. So 3.5 years into this agreement, it's a relatively short amount of time, but I think even in that 3.5 years, you can see an incredibly broad and deep expansion of trade. So there's some real results in CETA. And it's significant that these have resisted and to some extent cushioned against a greater impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. There's of course been an immediate and strong impact on the Canadian and Irish economies. There is no doubt our businesses have suffered, particularly of course, domestically facing services-based economies and small businesses, including restaurants and pubs. There's been a disproportionate impact on SMEs and of course also vulnerable groups. In that context, it's therefore, I think, all the more important to say that our trade is still higher in 2020 than it was in 2016. Our trade essentially remained incredibly resilient. And I think at very important times, particularly on food security, on food items, and now on vaccines, where Canada is deeply appreciative of EU exports of the Pfizer and Moderna products to Canada during this first part of the exporting of vaccines here in 2021. Again, incredible resilience in our two-way relationship. As our businesses face the difficult prospect of economic recovery, CETA will continue to help them build confidence in a volatile world. So I've told you a little bit about where we were in 2016 and how we've gotten to 2020 and 2021. Now let's look even further into the future. And the question put before the panelists is trade fit for purpose? And I'd say not only is CETA fit for purpose, you have Canada, and I know for sure the EU and Ireland's commitment that it will and must keep evolving. CETA is a strong asset ensuring our economies recover from COVID, and as we transition to a digital and low carbon economy. As you know, 2021 is a critical year for climate action. Under the Paris Agreement, all countries must come forward with higher levels of ambition for reducing greenhouse gas emissions if we are to keep global warming to an average of 1.5 degrees Celsius. On April 22nd, Canada announced a significant increase in its ambition, raising our target from 30% to 40 to 45% below 2005 levels by 2030. Meeting this target will require concerted efforts across the economy and investments in infrastructure and clean technologies. Climate change is a global challenge, and we are only going to be able to tackle it together. And under CETA, Canada and EU businesses have been able to position themselves for this new clean energy future. For example, by facilitating the deployment, the actual application and utilization of clean technologies. And I think here of Canadian companies like CarbonCure, a recent winner of the X Prize, that's improving carbon capture with new technologies for cement. The amazing Canadian companies Hydrogenics and Ballard working on hydrogen-powered transit and energy storage, and renewable energy investors like our Canadian pension funds and private equity partners like Brookfield, who are major investors in Ireland. So all of these actors coming together, along with financial institutions and governments, are going to create a green and more resilient future. And CETA anticipates and is ready for that. Our total two-way trade in environmental goods grew 16.5% from 6 billion euros in 2016 to 7 billion in 2019. And despite the pandemic, Canadian exports of environmental goods to the EU remained basically flat, even as trade and logistics became incredibly challenging over much of 2020. And this growth in Canada-Ireland trade in environmental and clean technologies is even further above this trend. In 2019, which is the latest data we have, Canada imported 30 million euros in environmental and clean technology products from Ireland, and we exported 18 million euro in environmental and clean technology products to Ireland. Canada-Ireland trade in environmental and clean tech products has more than doubled. It's at 161% more since 2016. The future is also one that's increasingly digital, high tech, and online. The propensity to use e-commerce by business to make international sales is only growing. And we have incredible Canadian companies like OpenText and Shopify, who are investors in Ireland, helping to facilitate businesses in reaching new customers through online sales channels and in business-to-business sales. CETA creates the right marketplace to allow for conditions for businesses to scale up and benefit from this increasingly global services and digital economy. We've eliminated tariffs on tech products. We're actively engaged in the continuity of Canada's adequacy status under the EU General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR. And again, in 2018, and looking at that period until today, Canada's ICT sector has not only outperformed the Canadian economy overall in output, but also in employment and innovation growth, a factor that it very much shares with Ireland, attracting an incredible amount of US FDI, again, very similar to our Irish cousins. Looking ahead, Canada, Ireland, and the EU are thus very well positioned through CETA to capture the significant economic opportunities that the transition to the low carbon and digital economy will create. So this brings me to my final set of remarks about how we develop and cultivate our relationship. We have a rich institutional framework. I want to just make sure that I share with this group that Canada and EU have, of course, not just a trading relationship, but a deep relationship based on shared values, the protection of human rights, a total commitment to feminism, LGBTQ rights, nested in a strategic partnership relationship that's vastly older than CETA. We have a more than 25-year-old science and technology agreement. We have over 50 committees, dialogues, and working groups that include researchers, academics, the private sector, scientists, and others working on climate, development, and other forms of digital issues and artificial intelligence. And the active involvement of this diverse group of actors through the CETA domestic advisory groups and our civil society forum has played an important role in keeping CETA up to date, but also, again, future-proof or resilient as new issues evolve. Canada's Minister of Small Business and International Trade, Mary Ng, met recently with her EU counterpart. They share a really fantastic relationship. Executive Vice President and EU Commissioner for Trade Dombrovskis just recently held the second CETA Joint Committee meeting, and it was a good opportunity to oversee some of the elements that I've described, as well as review new measures taken by both parties to facilitate the continuation of preferential trade during the pandemic. And they called on further action to work on bringing our SMEs closer together to ensure that businesses are using the agreement, as well as the people-to-people aspects of this for students, for temporary entry into Canada, for working in real time between services teams in Canada and the EU, and to continue to tackle sustainable development and climate change. So despite the huge challenges brought on by COVID-19, CETA continues to work as intended. And most importantly, it signals that Canada and Europe will very much stay open for business and new forms of collaboration that are absolutely needed in order for us to recover as quickly as possible from the pandemic, working with incredible partners like the US, taking note of the incredible demand coming online increasingly from middle income countries and the middle class growth in Asia, and with traditional partners, of course, like the United Kingdom. And for all of us, this economic recovery cannot come soon enough. So to conclude, let me just take note of the motto of the Statistical and Social Inquiry Society of Ireland. It is, our pole star is truth. And Danny, I think you've got the motto there behind you on your backdrop. And of course, Canada can't be more aligned with that idea of using data for judging CETA and our trade agreements on its results, but also using data and information to keep up our engagement, keep our agreements current, and to prepare for the two key trends of demands for reshoring, industrial policy, and the production of things like vaccines potentially closer to home as we expand our production capacity in all regions of the world, but also to prepare for the global virtual services economy, where we see so much opportunity for new ways of doing business, bringing people together closer, faster, and increasing the diversity of who can access trade, and at the same time, reducing the carbon and environmental footprint of our important methods of exchange. Thanks, Danny.
Thanks very much, Ailish. That's great. Looking forward to the Q&A. Plenty there on CETA and the digitalization, lots of topical things I'm sure that we picked up. Over to you now, Martina. So Professor Martina Lawless of the Economic and Social Research Institute.
Thanks very much, Danny. Thanks to everybody for asking me to be here, and to the two previous speakers. I'm going to share my screen here. Danny, can you let me know if everybody can see this? Obviously, as an economist, I am completely incapable of speaking without having some pictures and numbers behind me. So we're going to talk a little bit from a fairly, I think, sort of high level about international trade and investment agreements, rather than, so the previous two speakers talked a little bit in depth about two of the highest profile ones that the Irish audience would be familiar with at the moment, our trade agreements with the UK and with Canada. I'm going to give a little bit more of a, I guess, a bird's eye view of the most common elements of these kind of agreements and how they've evolved over time. And in particular, we look a lot at how they've become much deeper and more complex over time as they kind of grow into much more comprehensive treaties. I looked in a little bit at some of the evidence on what impact free trade and investment agreements have on actual levels of trade and investment between countries. And just to kind of spoiler alert there, it's largely shown, as Chris will have mentioned, that they have very, very positive impacts on increasing the amount of trade and investment between countries. So that's not terribly surprising, but we talk a little bit about how that can vary across the type of agreements as well. So obviously, as with the two previous speakers, and as a largely trade economist, focus a lot on the real benefits of this. But I'm also going to talk a little bit about some of the kind of complexities and controversies that have attached themselves to international trade and investment agreements. And some of the reasons people maybe kind of are wondering, are these kind of fit for purpose at the moment? So a couple of them, just to kind of pick on three specific issues that I'm going to talk about in a little bit more depth, is first of all, the importance of standards in these agreements, and this idea that, like, there needs to be a level playing field, but who exactly gets to define what the level playing field is and how it's measured is an important element. Rules of origin were one of the kind of big issues that emerged in the first weeks post-Brexit. So I want to talk a little bit about the kind of complexity of that. And then finally, one of the issues that kind of, I guess, bedevils people in terms of investment agreements in particular is how exactly disputes get resolved. And that's probably one of the more controversial elements of some of these recent agreements. So in terms of trade agreements, they really changed a lot over time. As Chris mentioned there, original trade agreements of 40, 50 years ago were really pretty much all about tariffs and quotas. These are often kind of a surprisingly minor part. I mean, think in the UK EU negotiations, the tariffs took very little, I think, time from the negotiators relative to all of the discussion on standards and other elements. Tariffs still remain, quotas still do remain important in terms of agricultural products, which countries often find kind of are still sensitive and are still protected sectors, particularly in developed countries. And that's becomes an issue then in terms of negotiating free trade agreements between kind of richer and poorer countries, where agricultural products are one of the areas where poorer countries may have actually something of a comparative advantage, but it's one of the sectors that remains most protected in richer countries. At the same time, the focus of most trade agreements does remain largely on goods trade. Obviously, CETA is, as has just been discussed by Ailish, much more extensive and comprehensive in its coverage of services trade than a lot of the others. And services do feature more in investment treaties. But there's still kind of a little bit of an unevenness in terms of trade agreements focusing much more on goods trade and on liberalizing goods trade, whereas services trade is very much the most rapidly growing part of it. Trade. And there's still a lot more limitations across countries and more reliance on unilateral decisions on access and perhaps there. So the tariffs and quotas themselves are largely now a relatively kind of minor point. How exactly goods qualify for zero tariff status is now probably the bigger element under negotiation. First of all, just to kind of show a graph of how extensive the growth has been in trade agreements over time. This is some data from the WTO, which shows the number of trade agreements, and the bars is the number of agreements signed every year over time. And then the solid line shows the rapid expansion and the cumulative total of trade agreements in existence. But along with the kind of increase in the number of trade agreements and the corresponding fall then in global most favored nation tariffs. As I said, no longer kind of really the big focus of a lot of these deals. They've kind of lowered just really across the board. Although still with a lot of variation across countries. So tend to be very low in richer, more developed countries. Tariffs still something of a trade policy tool amongst poorer countries, but really kind of have lowered across the board over time. But probably the kind of more defining element of recent trade agreements is the change in complexity. This move away from the trade agreements are very much about setting tariffs and perhaps quotas in some projects to covering a whole range of different issues and getting much more in depth. So this is a measure of kind of the depth or complexity of trade agreements put together by a team at the Design of Trade Agreements research project. And you can see there from 1990, particularly up through 2020, a very strong increase in the level of kind of complexity and depth of coverage of these trade agreements. And when I say complexity and depth of coverage, what sort of things do we mean? So these are some of the areas that are now typically covered in trade agreements. And so they've been divided basically into two different categories. WTO Plus is where it's going into more depth on issues that are part of the general mandate of the World Trade Organization. So that does include customs and tariffs, but gets into SPS measures, technical barriers to trade, anti-dumping. It's all very much kind of in the WTO mandate, but getting into more and more detail and more liberalization. But then we've also expanded beyond the traditional WTO mandate in lots of the more recent trade agreements. And this is where these categories that are known as WTO-X come in. And so modern trade agreements, comprehensive agreements often come with a whole range of policies and agreements on environment, on investment, on labor standards, on digital and data sharing, on consumer protection, on research and technology. So that just won't go through the whole list, but you can see when we talk about comprehensive agreements, there's a real huge variety of issues that are now incorporated within trade and investment treaties that really go far beyond the kind of traditional trade specific kind of measures. So do these have any effect on trade? Well, the kind of simple answer is yes, they do. So this is some work by Matu, Malabek and Russia very recently looked across a whole range of different trade agreements between countries. You'll notice there they look both at whether or not there is a trade agreement and also whether it's a deeper agreement. And there's very strong positive correlations there between having a free trade agreement, having a more in-depth free trade agreement, and the level of trade being created between countries. Likewise, if we look at the impact of free trade or agreements on FDI flows, we find again there's a very strong overall impact. So having a preferential trade agreement is the terminology they use here. Just having it as a kind of 1-0 dummy variable increases FDI by about 31%. But you can see that the size of the impact there varies quite a lot by the depth of the agreement. So having just a very simple basic trade agreement has some impact on FDI, but not that, relatively modest, whereas the deeper you go in terms of how comprehensive the agreement is, the larger the impact you'll have in terms of FDI flows. So largely the agreements kind of accomplish what they set out to do, which is to increase the flows of trade and investment across countries. So that's a really positive news. They've gotten much more comprehensive and in depth over time, and they basically achieve largely what they've set out to do. But to move on to some of the kind of maybe sort of controversies that and complexities that come with these agreements. The first is, as I said, and this has been already touched on by the previous speakers, these agreements are now as much about setting standards and mutual recognition of goods as they are about actually setting tariffs or quotas. So this idea that the terminology was used a lot during the EU-UK negotiations was that you had to have a level playing field. So obviously, in theory, this is a perfectly reasonable idea. You need to have some common rules. And the objective there is to prevent one country's producers undercutting the others, either by getting government subsidies that artificially lower their cost of production, or by cutting costs themselves through lower labor and environmental standards rather than having sort of efficiency improvements. So on the labor environmental standards, there's a kind of a public policy good there in and of itself, that you want kind of good international environmental standards, but there's also an economic motivation for that in terms of if you allow countries to kind of cut costs by not living up to various labor and environmental standards in particular, that maybe gives them a cost advantage that's unfair if they have full access to your market. So those are the kind of the motivations, which make a lot of sense. Complications in practice, and this is where a lot of the difficulties in negotiations come apart, is basically, the level playing field and the standards needs to be kind of decided. And in some cases that might be by kind of nice equal negotiation, but a lot of times it comes very much down to sort of the power dynamic in the negotiations. And are these, in particular negotiations between very large, rich developed countries and smaller, perhaps poorer countries, are the standards just being kind of effectively imposed? And that leads on to the sort of second complication in practice, which is that a lot of the exceptions, for example, in terms of agricultural subsidies, are likely to favor richer countries, in particular the costs of meeting some standards maybe kind of very kind of disproportionately impact on the competitiveness of poorer countries. The second issue, and again, this was one of the big themes of the EU-UK talks over the last year, is what happens to standards over time. So trade agreements really are not signed and decided and then kind of frozen in time. Standards evolve, local rules will change, and what happens? How do you upgrade or update your trade agreement? And whether or not that's an agreement to not lower standards, or whether there's agreements that you will kind of both change your standards in step with one another going forward. It's obviously kind of like something in terms of the EU-UK talks that was very important. And there comes one of the kind of the big trade-offs that any sort of economic integration agreement will bring, which is the difference between, or the trade-offs between market access and the kind of the rules you have to sign up for to get access to another country's market, in particular the EU, where there's a kind of the customs union, the single market have very specific requirements, versus your sovereignty and being able to set your own rules. My great example of where complexity and unintended impacts of trade agreements come by. So these are Percy pigs, and for anybody who kind of wasn't following the first weeks of Brexit very closely, one of the slightly unintended consequences, or an area where people hadn't spent a lot of attention during the negotiations, was how important rules of origin were in having your product qualify. And basically this means that although there's no tariffs on goods between the UK and the EU because of the trade agreement, this only applies to goods that are actually substantially produced within either the EU or the UK. And you have to basically prove that your good originates in either the EU or the UK to qualify for no tariffs. And again, that makes kind of perfect sense because you otherwise might run the risk that one country or the other is used as a kind of a tariff avoiding backdoor into a market. If the hypothetically, the UK was to sign a free trade, zero tariff agreement with China, then the EU would worry that goods would just ship themselves into China, from China to the UK, into the EU market and not pay any tariffs that they would be due to the EU. But in practice, as you can see from this very helpful graph produced by the UK HMRC, the amount of paperwork and the ways in which you prove that your good qualifies for no tariffs can be relatively complex. And it also, in terms of the Percy pigs example, has various goods that can kind of fall between two stools. So the issue with Percy pigs was that they were actually produced in Germany. They are able to be moved to the UK completely tariff-free. But if Marks and Spencer's then shipped them onto Ireland, suddenly they weren't a UK product, but because they had moved through the UK, they weren't an EU product coming directly to Ireland anymore. So they didn't qualify for origin on either of the usual two measures, which suddenly left them liable for tariffs despite actually being an EU product. And these kind of, with increasingly complex rules and regulations, unintended consequences and things that fall, items that fall kind of between two clauses are likely to be an issue. But moving on, so those are two of the complexities that we saw quite a bit in terms of the recent Brexit negotiations in particular. In terms of bilateral investment treaties, probably one of the biggest and most controversial elements is how disputes between investors and the country get decided. So in most investment treaties and in a lot, investment clauses in free trade agreements, so the two are kind of used a little bit interchangeably here, you have what are known as investor-state dispute settlement clauses. There's about 3,000 of these when you take all of the different investment treaties between all of the different pairs of countries possible. And again, there's a very kind of clear and sort of sensible motivation here, which is that these are to protect investors from taking their money to another country and then having the government of that country make some change to the rules that either expropriates their goods, that prevents them from repatriating their profits, that discriminates against the foreign investor in favor of domestic producers, for example. And so the idea is that these clauses in the treaty sign states up to kind of treat all foreign investors in a kind of fair and sensible way. And they started to appear in bilateral investment treaties pretty much in the late 60s, early 70s, when investors were putting a lot of money into kind of newly independent states. And there were serious concerns that a sudden changing government might lead to a nationalization of an industry and to the loss of your kind of funds or investment by the country. So that was the motivation. The second motivation was previously these kind of any disputes between an investor and a state, a foreign state, would be kind of need to be resolved at a sort of political diplomatic level. And there was an element here of maybe depoliticize some of these international treaty disputes if they just related to a single firm, to allow the firm to appeal to an arbitration in the state, rather than having to raise it at a state-to-state level. So the standard features of these clauses are that an investor can bring a claim directly against the host state. The dispute goes to a tribunal for arbitration. The tribunals are set up basically specifically for each individual dispute. There's not a standing tribunal in most cases. And both sides are involved in selecting the members of the tribunal. So that's the motivation. Where the controversy comes in is that although these clauses largely got put in to sort of protect investors from unfair measures by states, there's now concern that they're actually the sort of power dynamic has shifted in the other direction, and they're being used by large multinational companies to put pressure on countries. So the most probably famous case of this kind of investor-state resolution dispute case being taken was Philip Morris, the big tobacco company, suing the Australian government for losses that it would incur when they brought in their plain packaging laws. And there's many other countries. Australia was basically the first country to bring in these plain packaging laws. Many other, including Ireland, have followed. But Philip Morris brought a case. It took 6 years to dispute it. As you can see here, cost the Australian government quite a lot of money. The Australian government eventually won the case. But it was an example where, and this is one of the big concerns about these kind of systems, is that there was a feeling that large companies are basically now in a position to influence decisions being taken in each country. So the concerns about these are that, first of all, this level of power being given to large firms. On the other hand, the cases are actually most often won by the state. As I said, in the Philip Morris case, Australia won, or the cases are settled. However, when we say the state generally wins, there's a little bit of a sense in which the state just doesn't lose, because although it's liable for compensation, if the investor wins, the state has to compensate them. The state doesn't get any compensation from the investor if it wins the case. So the state stands to lose a lot, doesn't actually really gain that much if it wins. The main concern people raise about this, and the main objections you see to investor-state dispute resolutions, is that it places some limits on domestic legislation. Now that's actually, technically not true. Nothing in any of these treaties or clauses can make a state change its laws or require it to go back and change, prevents it from making any changes to its domestic regulations, or makes it change the regulation even if it loses the case. What does happen, however, is that they may have to pay compensation to investors that are affected by changes. So in that case, there may be a slight disincentive to make some changes to regulations if there's a feeling that they may be challenged and may end up costing money, but they can't actually force the state to change the rules themselves, just that they may have to pay off a particular investor. Other kind of objections that are raised to these are that the process can be slow, it can be very costly. Even if the state does win, they don't always get their legal costs covered, and that there's basically a bit of an ad hoc nature to the tribunals that can lead to inconsistent outcomes. In particular, because the arbitrators are chosen just for one case at a time, there's no consistency or continuity between them, and there's very little ability to challenge that outcome. So for all of these reasons, there's a lot of emphasis on reform of this system going on now, but at EU level and at the international level, the United Nations are looking into sort of models of an investment court that would be more like the WTO's trade resolution court. And that's one of the big reforms where the CETA agreement differs from earlier bilateral investment treaties, is that there's a change to this dispute resolution format where it's more of a single established court rather than these ad hoc tribunals that existed before. So that, I think, takes me to the end of my time, and just the quick summary up there is very kind of high level and quick overview of the evolution of these agreements over time. And I guess the key point is that they have a very positive link to greater trade and investment, but that does come with kind of increased levels of complexity, bringing more trade-offs perhaps, and more disputes that are likely to arise. So it's a devil in the detail is my answer to the question mark on whether they're fit for purpose or not.
Thanks very much, Martina. So I think all of our panelists, Chris, Ailish and Martina, will come on screen there now. And I'll open it up to the floor. If you can raise your hand or actually just come directly on, depending on what suits. So anybody want to ask the first question?
Danny, I will if we need to break the seal. I have a question for I suppose all the panelists, but in particular Chris, because he mentioned it about winning over the public, and this is something that you see in a lot of economics research around how the public reacts to trade and how trade can reshape their livelihoods and so on. What are the key challenges now in terms of communicating the benefits of trade, especially given how prominent it is in the public discourse in the UK over the last number of years? What have he and his colleagues seen as the kind of key challenges in relation to public acceptance of free and fair trade? And other panelists may want to come in, but given that Chris raised it, I thought I might ask him first.
Great, thank you very much. Well, I think that a number, just to draw out some, I mean, my sense is, in general, if you ask people, do they think that trade is a good thing, or is sort of free trade a good thing, quite a large proportion of people, at least in the UK, and I guess in the EU too, will say, yeah, they support it, it's a good thing. I think where that gets challenged is often on the issues that, as you just some of the issues that Martina was referring to as well. If there is perceived to be a threat, say in the UK, to our health service, if there's a measure that is seen to be sort of reducing standards. I mean, famously, we've had it in the UK where we're going to all have to eat chlorinated chicken. You get these sort of specific issues which sometimes may have a grain of truth, sometimes no truth at all, but they can get a real degree of concern. So that's I think a key area. Another sort of point is, while in general trade is good for the economy and lifts up overall economic growth and so on, of course one of the reasons it is good is because it introduces more competition, and the nature of competition is that not everyone wins. So while in the general term, openness is great, it can mean that for particular firms or particular industries, actually that competition can be damaging. And it's not much comfort if you're a person losing their job, say, oh, well, don't worry, overall employment has increased. It doesn't necessarily count for much if your particular job happens to have gone. So I think those are the two areas where there can be real challenge.
Ailish or Martina, would you like to come in on that point?
Yeah, I can just build really quickly by saying that, there's been a lot of usual suspects in trade policy. Certainly in my career in trade in the last 15 years, the structure of consultations, it kind of favored the people who had the time and the energy to show up. It favored people, and I'll just say I've arrived in Brussels and I'm still 4 months in trying to figure out all the EU institutions, and I expect I'll be in a continuous learning environment for the rest of my career, but it's a terribly complex place. And what that means is that we did not hear in the same ways that I think we're hearing now, particularly from small businesses, women-led businesses. I was intrigued as Canada's chief trade commissioner, a role that I played for 3.5 years, to hear businesses say things like really super smart people, but they're, really busy running their companies and saying, oh, I just thought trade agreements were for basically big companies. And I really love Martine's story on rules of origin. That's a fantastic story, because when you start to explain some of the highly detailed step-by-step, aspects of rules of origin and cumulation, I mean, most people's eyes just glaze over. This is really technical stuff. So making the agreements, not just live for lawyers and trade negotiators, but finding new ways to communicate the benefits of these agreements, and then putting more aspects of our consultations online. That's been really critical. And for Canada, we still have work to do, particularly to ensure, and it's a commitment we certainly take seriously under Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Committee, for example, to reach out in even more detail to our Indigenous communities and empower more communicators of these trade agreements in Indigenous communities, for new Canadians like recent immigrants who will kind of, if you will, interpret and use the agreements in new ways and give us feedback where there are shortcomings. So I'm a big fan of basically continuous improvement and using social media to actually, really listen to feedback. Thanks.
Thanks, Ailish. Martina, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I think I'd just follow up on Chris's point about kind of convincing people that trade agreements are good, and if you're one of the potential losers, that really for trade agreements to be effective, they need to be part of a much wider set of economic policies where there is recognition, perhaps in each individual country, that some areas might lose out by this increase in competition. And I think some of that kind of dissatisfaction with globalization has come from maybe that economists focus very much on, yes, well, there was a net positive to this, without looking at the balance between the kind of those who gained and those who lost, and rather trying to make sure there's some sort of, if you can't make it equitable, have more process of like bringing people kind of up to the same level, or some transfers between them, but more recognition of that there are areas, and whether it's sectors or individuals, that might lose out, is probably key to kind of getting people on board with the fact that it is an overall net benefit to the economy.
Thanks, Martina. Suzanne Drisdall, I see you there. Do you want to come on in?
Yes, hi, Danny, and hi, Ambassador Designate Ailish and everyone else. I'm Suzanne Drisdall from the Canadian Embassy in Dublin, and very interested to hear everyone's presentation. And just to follow up on previous points, I'm a trade commissioner by career, and my job is to translate trade agreements and policy into real understandable benefits to companies. And absolutely, I agree that, for example, many of our technology companies and services companies may not realize that CETA actually has many benefits for them. It's not just about tariffs. So some of things like the procurement and labor mobility, I think it's so important to tell stories and give examples when we have an audience of how it actually impacts specific companies in practical ways. We're constantly doing that as the Trade Commissioner Service. And I think sometimes some of these theoretical aspects of trade policy, that's exactly what's needed, is like a translation. And that's what we're doing here in Ireland, reaching out to many industry organizations and companies on the ground to show them how CETA actually benefits them in practical ways. Thank you again for this event. It's really interesting.
Thank you, Suzanne. Frances Ruan, I see you have a question there.
Yeah, thank you very much. They were three terrific talks and spanning very wide range. I suppose one of the issues that has often struck me, and I've heard Ailish talk very eloquently before about trade policies and making trade deals, and it's all about detail. And as you know, as touched about, the devil is in the detail. But there's a really big issue that when politicians come to sell trade deals, they want to make it look really simple. So you get this contrast of huge detail being required and people working very hard over many years, and a politician coming in to make this sound like a really simple thing. Now, my question really is, how can that gap be filled? And in fact, I'm asking the question, are economists part of the problem? Because when lawyers talk about trade, they immediately get very complicated. But when economists talk about trade, they very often go back to very first principles and they make it seem simple, which I think is why in discourse, they make the politicians, that's the route they take. They don't follow the detail of the lawyers about subsection 23D, subsection 5F or whatever. So I'm just wondering, how could economists become part of the solution? If they are indeed, as I suggest, maybe part of the problem. So thank you all very much. But just a question to as people who are right involved in this, how do we actually make this work? Because I think it does matter a lot. I think you could very easily tip a balance where the world will become very anti-trade, and that comes out of this gap in the discourse. And yes, of course, how do you bring people into that space? Thank you all very much.
Thanks, Frances. I'll direct that maybe to Ailish to start with, then over to you, Chris.
Frances, it's wonderful to see you. Thanks so much for joining us tonight. You just made my evening. I miss seeing you and others very much. So I'm sure Danny will convene us all again in person as soon as the pandemic is over. I think you asked a really brilliant question. And let me tell you something. When I started my career in trade negotiations, I asked what I thought was, a pretty straightforward, practical question, which is, well, like, what if someone is polluting the environment? As a student, I'd been actually very active in clean water and wastewater issues. And, how do you differentiate between a product that was made using environmentally sound processes and one that was not? And the answer at the time, which I thought was like, not terribly smart, was we don't care about anything that happens behind the border, right? Do you remember this PPM, product processing measures? We don't care about PPMs. All we're doing is trading the pen, and however anyone made it is fine. And as someone who was, had a labor market background, I also thought to myself, well, for example, if you haven't implemented the ILO labor market core labor conventions, preventing child labor, for example, does that mean we should treat that, a textile product the same one as the other? And I didn't think so, but that was kind of where we were at. And now we're moving. I mean, it's taken a heck of a long time, but I think we're moving to bring in these other disciplines. So I would say, Francis, it's asking questions about the distribution, right, of benefits, which I think Chris and others have talked about this evening. Bringing in labor market economists. I think it's bringing in, environmental specialists and having them ask the tough questions. And I think what we're seeing in the new U.S. administration, right? Biden has talked a lot about this foreign policy for the middle class. And I think what that also means is that you're not just going to see that neoliberal, kind of an open markets raise all boats kind of argument. It's about much more than having those social policies, the redistribution, the active labor market measures. It's really what and how we're trading. And the last point I'll make is we're seeing alongside trade policy, sanctions policies becoming much more active. And so whether it's human rights, which was included in our new NAFTA agreement and provisions against prohibitions on trading in product made by forced labor, which is, again, I just go back to this, is a very old ILO core labor convention, for example, that we're just animating in the new NAFTA agreement, or whether it's sanctions against corrupt businesses. I think the public is not only, in terms of domestic tools, but also saying, hey, it's not just good enough that you have this, multilateral or bilateral trade agreement. You've also got to bring the environmental provisions and human rights provisions alongside the trade agreements. I hope that's some insight.
No,
That's great. I'm going to go to Chris next, and Martina, given that you're the problem, we'll come to you last. Okay, Chris.
Great, thank you. Just a few thoughts again. I thought it was a great question, Francis. I think, first of all, without wanting to play with words too much, I think there's a difference between being sort of simple and simplistic. I think sometimes it's fine to be simple in terms of giving the sort of key messages, and politicians, all of us have to do it to a certain extent. I sometimes think of it being like a sort of an iPad, but sort of the front cover may make things look quite simple. There's all sorts of complexity inside it. You don't necessarily need to know about all the complexity if you're just sort of think about how to use a deal or understand the key messages. So I think simple messaging is fine, as long as it isn't sort of glossing over sort of key details that make it go from simple to be simplistic. And I think that is a risk sometimes, that we sort of gloss over some of the challenges within trade. I would say it's not just on the politician side. I mean, I would say this when I as a civil servant, but sometimes some of the criticisms of trade and the critics can be incredibly simplistic too. And I think it's just one of the sort of factors of communication at the moment. I suppose it's the sort of Twitter thing, isn't it? That a really complex issue gets sort of boiled down to some little slogan. I remember one of the slogans against TTIP, which just said sort of, if there's anything you've ever cared about, TTIP is threatening it. Those sort of statements, and they're sort of quite compelling, and people think, oh, TTIP must be this terrible thing. So I think there's simplistic narratives on both sides. Final thing I'd say, just before Martina comes on, just so she's not left completely alone on the economists. I think economists can be a key part of the solution, certainly, and they're really helpful back in terms of making this real. I think if we talk about saying a FTA, well, it's produced 0.001% of GDP increase, that sort of level of economic analysis is not very helpful, because it's sort of too vague and it's too small. But when you can turn it into something really tangible about a real benefit for a real business in a real place, then that, I think, starts working in terms of winning the case for trade. But Martina, over to you as the victim of the question.
Oh dear, I think there possibly is an element where Francis is talking about the kind of economists and the trade lawyers speaking separately to the politicians and to the public, where maybe the answer is for the economists and the lawyers or the trade negotiators to talk more to one another during the process. I think the economists focus very much on the objective and the kind of the principle of what you want from a trade agreement, and maybe those are often kind of quite simple to say, whereas the lawyers really need to write down in kind of like bulletproof language how that will be operationalized. And perhaps economists don't get very much involved in, well, how will that work in practice? What kind of form will we use to collect that detail? How will we define origin? You know, economists just say, well, yeah, of course, it should be a good from that country. We don't want tariff hopping, but they won't sit down and think about, you know, what does that mean? So perhaps there is more of a role, not so much in the kind of selling it to the public, but even in the background, the economists and lawyers to be more involved together in sort of how exactly these rules can be kind of put into practice, so that they kind of don't get overly complex. But I'm glad I'm not the one who has to write the actual deals. It's much easier to put the free trade agreement dummy variable into a regression and say that has a nice positive impact. So maybe I'm taking a little bit of the easy way out there.
I might, as chair, abuse my position on the last question of the evening, which is about the fit for future. So given that intangible assets are driving so much value, even the public can get their head around the logistics of moving a tangible good across a border, but it gets much more complex when we're talking about intangible intellectual property. And we've seen some of the debate on trade has kind of moved away from the individuals, so to speak, and appears to be about big corporates versus the state. What's the view, particularly coming with CETA, I suppose, at the moment, to start with you, Ailish, on the moving away from the investor dispute systems towards the investment protection court idea? What's different? Here's a simple, simplistic one. To the person in the street, what's the difference between what was there and what's in these modern future agreements?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think the big difference is that I think, are much more clear about the space that national governments have to regulate on all kinds of issues. And again, I go back to, let's judge this agreement on the, kind of on the reality, on the lived experience. And in that sense, public health and environmental provisions are, crystal clear as being areas where the state has the right to regulate. And the pandemic's only going to give us more examples of where that's come into effect, not least, for example, on some actions by various states on vaccines. I would also say the second thing is to make those cases, kind of run more efficiently, to identify alternative places where they can be heard, to basically empower more places to develop the commercial courts that can hear these cases. So it's not just sort of the rarefied justices of London, England that can hear these cases, but other qualified courts. And I think, I come back to, we've had a lot of experience, frankly, with our geography abutting against the most litigious, I would argue, economy on the planet, and that's the United States. And in all the years, and all the experience we've had on investor-state dispute, it's been a really rare case. And in those cases where Canada has lost, it's because we did take the choice to nationalize an entity or a plant or a production facility. And what's been interesting in our system is, I don't know if you know this, Danny, but provinces can take the decision to essentially appropriate a business, but it's the federal government that has to pay if an investor state case is successful. So in a few cases, we've seen some interesting federal dynamics, which I don't think will be at play for our European cousins. But again, I come back to the fact that we've had very few cases, and certainly none that have struck down environmental protection in our history.
Thanks, Ailish. Well, you can visit Walloon, I'm sure, as well, for a bit of real time on trade deals in the European side. Chris, on that issue around what you might see as underpinning of international protections, what lies in the UK prism at the moment?
I mean, first point I'd say is comes back to making sure that trade is fair as well as free. I think that is absolutely fundamental and recognised more and more. So it's key, I think, in terms of ensuring that we get support for our trade deals and that they do what we want, that we take that sort of fair side seriously, and we take the standards seriously, and then we make sure that what we're doing is manifestly not undermining and indeed supporting our interests on things such as environment and sustainability and so forth. I just want to say, though, I'm about to, because that can, I think that can be simplistic. And why I was thinking, you mentioned intellectual property, and I think it's a good example of an area where one of the reasons I think is so tricky is because whether or not you're doing a trade agreement, something like intellectual property, you're trying to balance sort of competing interests. On the one hand, you want to make sure that people who've invested in that intellectual property get rewarded for that, and they get the returns and they're incentivized for that. At the same time, you don't want so much protection that they have a monopoly position, or you've invented a new drug and then the sort of poorest can't afford it, and so on. And so they're inherently complex issues, these. So while they sort of may manifest in a trade dimension, I don't think it's just because they're in a trade deal that they're complicated. It's that the underlying issues are complicated and about making really difficult judgments and balances on which perfectly reasonable people, perfectly reasonable countries can come to a different view as to where that balance lies.
Thanks, Chris. Martina, last word with you, perhaps.
Well, thanks very much, Danny. I think in terms of for the future, there will be a lot more focus on these issues that are perhaps more related to services trade, in terms of intellectual property, where the company is delivering products but not located in the country, how exactly the kind of which state gets to regulate the product. We've seen that this is also a big issue, of course, in international tax, with companies being increasingly global and delivering their products in an increasingly sort of remote and intangible way. There's all sorts of complexities where trade theory, I think, is still, and trade economists are slightly struggling to keep up with the pace of developments, and rules that kind of made perfect sense when you were shipping a kind of crate of widgets from one side of the world to the other really need to be kind of reconsidered. But there are a lot of complexities in doing that, and I guess it's another area where writing down the kind of like the detail of how something's going to be implemented is really complicated, and can start to then deviate quite a bit from the simple principle that you want, which is to have trade be as free and as much on a level playing field as possible. But I don't think I have a particularly good solution. I think this is something that will be a subject of debate really on an ongoing basis for kind of years to come.
Thanks very much, Martina. I know the example is always given, you can't have international trade in haircuts, but I'm sure we're going to see a lot of tradable permits developing as we get released this evening for haircuts on the 10th of May, just announced. So listen, thank you, Martina, Chris, Ailish. It was really, really great to get such clarity and such insight from people who are at both the academic and creation of trade deals. So the Society really appreciates taking the time. I'm going to just hand over to Ronan, maybe just to say a few words for the next meeting, and then I'll bring it to a close.
Thanks very much, Danny. So I have two things. Firstly, if you did make a contribution this evening, I'll be following up if you can send through your contribution to secretary@sisi.ie. But thankfully, these days we can record it and I can track back as well. So I'll be able to follow up that way too. And as Danny mentioned, we have our next meeting of the Society will take place on the 27th of May, where we'll have a presentation in relation to the COVID pandemic and its severity in Ireland compared to some other countries. So details will go out to our mailing list on that, and if you're not on the mailing list and would like to join, just pop an email to secretary@sisi.ie or to my name, Ronan Lyons, at tcd.ie, it's just thank you, Maeve, has just put it in the chat there, and I'll add you to the email list, or you can check our website as well. And just to echo Danny's call, or Danny's thanks to everyone for the presentations and for coming along today.
Thank you. Yeah, and I see we got a YouTube channel there as well to pick this up a little later on as well. So the Flat Earth Society is beginning to elevate. So thanks again to everybody, and hopefully we will see each other in person soon. We'll try and arrange that. Okay. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks. Bye. Bye, Chris. Bye,
Thank you.
Martina. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Danny. See you. Cheers.
Thanks to you. Thanks, David, too.